We have got some breaking news involving Premier League regulations and player contracts, and I'm delighted to say our senior reporter Rob Dorsett joins us now. So look, Rob, what's the breaking news, first of all? It's complicated.
Right. It is complicated, but it's really important. So if you're a Chelsea fan in particular, listen up. But if you're a Premier League football fan generally, listen up, because the Premier League clubs have today voted on a really significant new rule, which says that the length of time with which a club can spread the cost of a transfer fee is going to be limited. So up till now, you could sign a player for 10 years and you could spread the cost of that transfer fee over that 10-year period of his contract. It's called amortisation. You don't need to know that word, don't worry about it.
I like it though.
But let's talk hypothetically. Say Manchester City sign a player for £100 million on a 10-year contract. Under the old rules, they'd be able to say, look, this is only going to cost us £10 million per year.
Yep.
And so they spread the cost of the transfer fee over the duration of the contract. And that is a massive help when it comes to meeting the providence and sustainability rules that the Premier League sets. From now on, you're only going to be able to spread that cost over a maximum of 5 years. So in the hypothetical example I've just given you, it would cost you £20 million a year for 5 years if you sign a player for on a £100 million fee. So look at Mykhailo Mudryk, for example, who's signed the longest contract in Premier League history when he joined from Shakhtar Donetsk, £88.5 million to Chelsea. Under that rule, because it was an 8-year contract, that £88.5 million fee was going to only cost him about £10 million a year. Chelsea have used it very, very carefully and very cleverly. And crucially, this is not going to be backdated. That's what the clubs have voted for today. So it will only be a new rule from here going forward. So those existing contracts that Chelsea have signed with their players are not affected.
So is this a good thing, a bad thing, or I'm not sure where I sit with this, because you could see why Chelsea were doing this, but they're trying to be more sustainable. So were they were trying to do that for the good of the game?
Well, I think the crucial thing is that this now brings the Premier League in line with UEFA's rules, which already had this in place. So you had a strange situation where the Premier League rules were different from UEFA rules, which is never easy and sustainable because clubs that are competing in European competition, they've got one rule for their league and one rule for their European competition. So it brings it in line with UEFA. And I think from a Premier League's perspective, what it does is it makes clubs more sustainable. It reduces their risk. What the Premier League, I think, is hoping here, and the Premier League clubs that have voted in favour of this, is that clubs won't take a risk. Because signing a player on an 8-year contract, if they then get an injury or they don't figure as part of your plans, you've got a heck of a financial burden for another 7 years plus, potentially. And so that's a worry for clubs and the risk of them potentially going bust in the future if there were a number of players that were in this circumstance. But I don't think anybody wanted to punish Chelsea here, who've kept completely within the rules, which is why they've decided not to backdate it. And crucially, it means Chelsea have had the advantage of the players that they've signed on long contracts, and they won't be punished going forward, but they won't be allowed to do that again in the future with new players that they sign on, that they transfer from other clubs, or with existing players that they want to give long contracts to. I mean, another example, of course, was Enzo Fernandez. Also signed a deal until 2031, £106 million his transfer fee, but spread out over 8 years. So again, a hugely reduced fee.
So might we see, lower prices then for players, basically?
No, I don't think it'll have any impact on transfer fees, I think is the truth, I'm afraid to say. It's an accounting procedure. That's what's changed here. It's the rules have changed in terms of how clubs can account for the players that they've signed and the players that they're offering new contracts to. But crucially, from Chelsea's perspective, they're not going to be at any disadvantage as a result of this new rule coming in. One thing I'm still waiting to check, I'm still waiting to get a direct answer on, is does this mean that clubs are no longer allowed to sign players for contracts longer than 5 years? Or, if they do so, can they only spread the cost of that contract over 5 years? So say it's an 8-year contract, can they still sign an 8-year contract, a player on an 8-year contract? Or now, are you only allowed to sign a player for 5 years? I'm waiting for confirmation on that. As soon as I get it, I'll let you know. And one other little thing that's been included in my message from the Premier League today, clubs have also approved a rule amendment so that the Premier League board can intervene if a club is owed money from a transfer fee that hasn't been paid. And they can stop the club that owes the money from registering any new players until they've paid their debt.
OK, so that's good in a way that they're giving them a bit of...
Yeah, it's transparency as much as anything else. It's saying, look, say, off the top of my head, say Manchester United owed Manchester City money for a transfer that they'd made. And then there was some dispute, and Manchester United didn't pay the second half of that instalment. And Manchester City went, this isn't fair, and they reported it to the Premier League, who investigated it. The Premier League board could come back and say, look, we think Manchester City have got a case here. So Manchester United, you're not allowed to register any new players until you've paid that debt to Manchester City.
Right.
Completely hypothetical, those two Manchester clubs I used there, I should make the point.
Yes.
And I've just had confirmation on that query that I wasn't sure about, by the way. They can make longer deals, but accounting-wise, it can only be spread over 5 years. So let me clear that up very briefly. 10-year contract, £10 million over that 10 years. That's £1 million a year they would have done. You can only do it over 5 years, so it'd be £2 million a year. So you still can sign longer contracts, only spread the cost over a maximum of 5 years.
All right, brilliant, as always.